Welcome to SWK 700, Week 8. The topic is Feminist Perspectives and Practice. This is your professor, Yvonne Ruiz, and let's begin our presentation. So we're building on last week's topic of humanistic, existential, and spiritual practice, and we're getting a little bit more specific, talking about feminist perspectives and practice. So let's start with feminist perspectives. There are 4 bullet points here. The first bullet point speaks to the important contribution that feminist perspectives have made to social work. The focus has been on explaining and responding to the position of women in our society, and especially the position of being discriminated, of being oppressed, of often being experiencing domestic and interpersonal violence, as well as the limitations of cultural norms and standards of beauty. So feminist perspectives have played a very important role for us in understanding our women clients. Women are the majority of clients who see social workers, and it's really important to note that the profession is made up of over 85% women. And especially, we need to add that the majority of social work practitioners are white women. The third bullet point makes a note that feminist perspectives are relevant to all oppressed groups, all populations who experience marginalization and oppression, because of the important concepts that feminist perspectives have raised within social work. And this perspective helps us to understand women's social role, the ways that women are subject to some limitations, the ways that women are subject to being caretakers for the most part, the ways that women are subject to perhaps not having a full range of opportunities to make decisions about their lives and their choices, and especially about their bodies. And then the fourth bullet point, feminist practice contributes practice methods and skills based on collaborative perspective, based on a collaborative practice, based on dialogue and group work that can be used to achieve and raising consciousness of social issues and women's position in society. It's important to note that feminist perspectives are also important in many other disciplines. There are women and gender studies that are majors in colleges. There are sociology perspectives on women in society. There are psychological perspectives. There are many ways of understanding feminist perspectives, and all of them have some commonalities. And these are some of the commonalities. One is that women are oppressed by social structures and relationships that privilege men and male views. So let me just say that the focus on feminist perspectives and on women arose as a response to the ways that men's experiences were seen as the norm. Much of the research in the 40s, 50s really used male subjects, male research participants, and male perspectives as the basis for developing theories. We've already talked about Freud a little bit. We've talked about Erik Erikson a little bit. And the feminist point of view was important to develop and include and think about as women gained more political power during the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, as well as economic power. Think about the ways that the family has changed. We've also looked at family systems, but think about the role of women in families. Most families are now dual earner families, so both men and women are working outside the home. Research has shown that women are still responsible for the majority of housework and childcare. So you may have heard the phrase the second shift. Many women go to work, they work a full day, and then they come home and they put in another shift, cleaning, cooking, and nurturing their family members. The second bullet point, widespread gender inequality and the consequences of exploitation and violence towards women. Feminist perspectives call attention to the ways that our society still needs to go a long way towards having equality in healthcare, in education, in politics, in economics. One small example is women still earn, I think, 86, 88 cents to a man's dollar. Don't quote me on the exact percentage, but women's pay does lag behind men's. And the third bullet point, in most societies, men are significantly more affected by poverty and many other social disadvantages than men. More women live in poverty. More women are single parents taking care of children. If there is a divorce in the family, it is more likely that the woman is going to suffer a lot more financially than the man. And finally, discrimination against women continues to be commonplace, economically and socially. I am sure that you can think of many of your own examples where, as a woman, you have felt devalued, or as a male student, you have witnessed women being devalued, the way women are discussed, evaluated, analyzed, and treated by many men. So I invite you to stop and reflect a moment and really think about what feminist perspectives can offer you as a social worker. And I'm including both female and male students, as well as students who identify as gender non-binary or gender fluid. Feminist perspectives contributed a perspective on oppression and marginalization that's very important to acknowledge and important to think about as social workers, since we often work with women who have disadvantages economically, socially, as well as a gendered discrimination. So Malcolm Payne does present the three waves of feminism. And I think it's important to look at the stages of how women have fought for more political power, more economic power, more equity in the workplace. So the first wave feminism has a history stretching back more than 100 years. It was concerned with gaining the right to vote. And along with the right to vote, it was about gaining political, legal, property, and other types of rights so that women could be seen as human and could be seen as people in their own right. 150 years ago, women were still considered property. So let's think about that and realize that, 100, 150 years ago is not really that long. Second wave feminism refers to the women's liberation movement. And that was a fight for equal economic, legal, and especially social rights starting in the 60s and 70s. And second wave feminism modeled itself after the fight for civil rights of the 1940s and 1950s. So there was a focus on gathering, on protesting, on raising consciousness. I think there are a lot of stereotypes about feminism that arose from the backlash in the 1960s and 70s, portrayed women as bra burners, portrayed women as wanting to be masculine, portrayed women as not able to attract men. So I think the word feminism and identifying as a feminist began getting a really negative connotation, which I think was unfair. I think which really creates some controversy for the word feminism and for identifying as a feminist today. But we need to acknowledge that there were a lot of ways that second wave feminism brought attention to the ways that women were mistreated, ways that women were objectified, and the ways that women were held back. During the 1960s and 70s, for example, many law schools did not accept women. Women did not enroll in medical school to become doctors. Now there's a lot more parity. I think actually there are more women who go to law school than there are men right now. There's parity in medical school. And the ways that women were able to advance professionally, even though you still hear about the glass ceiling. And I do think that if you think about the 2016 election, there was a lot of discussion on the misogyny and the ways that Hillary Clinton was perceived as the first woman seeking presidential office. So I think that for us in our current society, whether you're a younger woman, whether you're older, whatever your age, I still think that we feel some effects of oppression and marginalization and stereotyping that women experience. Third wave feminism started in the 1990s. And this is when attention began to be brought on questioning, on reclaiming, and redefining the ideas, the images, the words, and especially the way that media portrayed women and how media has transmitted ideas about what womanhood is all about, what femininity is all about, what it means to be a woman, and in many ways defining and shaping the expectations of women in our society. So thinking about gender behavior, for example, thinking about the standards of beauty, thinking about sexuality, ways that women are portrayed, ways that women are used to sell products, and their sexuality is used to sell products that have nothing to do necessarily with gender or with being a woman, or with being a man for that matter, but just the way sexuality is used as a seductive technique to encourage consumerism. I also want to mention that expectations, ideas, norms, images, all of those that shape women also shape men. So think about that for a moment. Men and women are often, or rather, femininity and masculinity are often portrayed as opposite ends. To be feminine, you can't have masculine characteristics. To be masculine, you can't have feminine characteristics. And feminist theorists, feminist writers, feminist practitioners have brought attention to the ways that both men and women are limited, if not sometimes affected negatively by gender expectations in our society. So I want to emphasize the point that feminist social work practice is inclusive. It's not only for women. In social work, feminist approaches raise concerns for women's personal and social conditions. They focus on women's distinctive voice, distinctive situations and position in society, on the ways that women's identity is shaped and developed, and also, especially, the acknowledgement of issues of diversity and equity for everyone in society. Feminist practice calls attention to power dynamics, which groups have power in society, which don't, which groups have privilege, can make decisions and shape people's life chances, and which groups don't have as much power. One of the critiques of second wave feminism in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 1980s was that feminism homogenized women's issues. It presented the issues as if they were all women's issues, without acknowledging that ethnicity and race play a role in shaping how a woman identifies, women's experience in our society, and how women are perceived in our society. So, Black feminism also began to emerge. Anderson Collins, Dominelli, they theorized and emphasized the diversity of women and the different kinds and combinations of oppression, right? Sexism was the oppression of women, but they especially talked about the connection with racism. They talked about the connection with social economic status. And they argued that sexism, class oppression, gender identity, and racism are interconnected. They're inextricably bound together. And that women experience multiple types of oppressions based on ethnicity, race, social class. And I would also include based on identification as a lesbian, as bisexual, as queer, as transgender. So I would also include those, especially because women's theorists and feminist perspectives are also discussing these issues. In 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw, a sociologist, argued that the experience of being a Black woman cannot be understood only in terms of being Black or only in terms of being a woman, but must include the interactions which frequently reinforce each other. Again, this goes back to the ways that sexism, classism, racism, misogyny, all these are interconnected. And thus, the intersectionality theory was born. So the image here looks at religion, age, disability, geography or region, culture, looks at income, sexual orientation, education, race, ethnicity, all of which intersect. So you can see the middle of the image where the intersections occur. So the multiple oppressions that you might experience based on any of these social identities can be compounded, can be increased, can be multiplied by a number of these factors. So I'm turning to feminist practice. So we're going to be talking in the next few slides specifically about practice from the approach of feminist social work. So there are three commonalities that Teeter identified in 2010. The first commonality is ending patriarchy. And more to the point, empowering women. And many of our clients are going to feel disempowered, devalued, might feel the oppression, might feel limited in many, many different types of ways. And ending patriarchy, what that means to me is that it ends the ways that genders are unequal, the ways that men are privileged and women are disempowered, and less privileged. So ending patriarchy is about striving for and creating opportunities for greater equity for women. Number two, understanding. Understanding individuals in their own social context. We've talked a lot about this and the importance of the person in environment. And for feminist practice, it's about understanding women's position, women's roles, how women's lives are shaped by forces that are greater than themselves. And it makes the connection that the personal is political, that living in this society as a woman makes a statement, that we cannot escape those power dynamics and the ways that women's lives are often shaped by forces greater than one's own sense of agency and choice. I think we can think about women's right to choose as an example of how the personal is political. And then finally, raising consciousness among both men and women that social structures establish gender inequalities. So I want to emphasize here, it's not that men are targeted. It's not that feminism is anti-male or anti-men. It's not that women want to supplant men and subjugate men, all of which are some of the stereotypes and some of the misconceptions about what it means to be feminist, but rather it's about raising the consciousness of both men and women on the ways that policies, on the ways that social norms, on the ways that expectations in the workplace, in education, in politics, can disempower women. An example of this is childcare. We don't have very good childcare options for working women. It definitely has an impact on the choices women make about working, whether to work full time, where to work, how much effort to put into one's career versus one's family. So I think in our society, there's often a choice women make, and sometimes the choice to stay home and raise your children is criticized, when in fact, respecting women's choices is part of feminist practice and feminist perspectives. Whether the choice is to establish a career and make that a priority, or whether it is making your family a priority. Whether the choice is to have children or to be child-free. Whether the choice is to form your family as where the male stays home and takes care of the children, and the woman goes out and brings home the bacon, so to speak, and they decide to create their own gender roles and gender expectations in the context of their own relationship and of the context of the needs of their family. This slide presents some important main points about feminist social work. Number one, this perspective and this practice approach avoids assumptions about social categories and personal characteristics based on gender. So what this means is that what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, are not assumed, but rather you learn from your client about their identity, about what is important to him or her, what it means to be a man or a woman in our society. The second bullet point, it avoids simplistic distinctions based on either or dichotomies of male-female. And I think that this has begun to be broken down, I think, in the past generation, with more questioning about gender roles, gender behavior, and where there is more discussion, more visibility people who choose to be gender fluid. And there's certainly a lot more research on the ways that individuals don't want to be put in a box and meet the expectations of society when it isn't their authentic self. The third bullet point questions the inevitability of women's roles in society. What this means is it inevitable that you are going to be a caretaker? Is it inevitable that you are going to nurture and support all of the family members, perhaps at your own expense, at your own self-care, at your own ambitions or goals? So what is it that your client's choices? What is it that your client values? What is it that your client sees for him or her future? Recognizes the social pressures that are placed on women. We've talked a little bit about media. I mean, that's a huge subject. Women and media. Lots of books. Whole courses are taught on that. I believe everyone can recognize the way that social norms and expectations place pressure on women to act a certain way, look a certain way, and to make choices that are going to be socially sanctioned or socially approved. And the next bullet point examines social and personal power dynamics. I want you to stop and think for a moment about your own relationships. Think particularly when you're in a mixed group. Who takes up more space in that group? Who speaks the most? Who participates the most? Who is more assertive or more aggressive? What are the ways that power plays itself out? Stereotypes place women as more mediators, as more acquiescing to male power. I don't know. Do you think that is still the case? I think about the ways that men hold space in social situations, the ways that men seem to have more ability to speak their minds, to discuss their opinions. I don't know, is this still true? Certainly was true when I was growing up. Maybe we can talk about this in class. And then the last bullet, focus on opportunities, equity, social justice, and violence against women. I would also include women in the criminal justice system. There's been more focus. I think of the example of women who are imprisoned and they're pregnant, and when they give birth, are their children taken away and they can't see their child? Some prisons have a program where women can actually spend time with their infant. We know from attachment that spending time with your infant is super important for both the mother and the infant. So I don't think that's a widespread program, but think about the ways that women are in the criminal justice system. Majority of women are there because they have been involved in some type of activity along with a man. So they have been targeted and perhaps imprisoned and taken the blame when blame actually belongs to more than just the woman. So Payne presents 4 areas of feminist practice. And with your female clients, it's likely that you may use one or all of these or any combination of these in your approach. One is women's conditions, the shared experiences of discrimination, oppression, social attitudes, gender norms, that there is a need to break some of that down, to acknowledge the impact of those on women's experience and women's life choices. I think it's difficult to work with a woman and not acknowledge her social context. And women's conditions in the social context are part of that, right? Number two, women-centered practice. So if you're working from a feminist approach, you're thinking about women being front and center. And that is quite different from the privileged position that men in our society hold. I understand. We can definitely talk about that, and there may be different perspectives on that as well. So focus on identifying women's needs and responding to women's needs, and not assuming that men and women have the same needs in the same way. Number three, women's different voice. Women's experience in the world is different from men, particularly in matters of social and moral concerns. We're going to talk a little bit about Carol Gilligan's work, and Payne also had a section on Carol Gilligan's work and the importance and her contribution to women's psychology. And finally, working with diversity. Anti-oppressive practice includes the identification of social diversity and a value on difference. So a word here on power dynamics and working with diversity from a feminist approach, feminist practice. It looks at the experience of white males as the experience that has been the most researched, the most discussed, the most normative, right? So it makes sense that a feminist approach would really include diverse perspectives, would include ethnic and racial perspectives, because of the ways that women and ethnic and racial groups have been defined and measured against the white male experience. Again, we can certainly talk more about this in class. Some of you may have taken courses on women's psychology, on gender studies, and many of you will have lots of ideas and points that you want to raise. So there are 5 concepts that are related to feminist social work practice. The first is a focus on social and personal identity. These are important aspects of creating a connection with your client and understanding where your client is coming from and what they've personally and professionally experienced. And it's also important to acknowledge and understand their social and personal identity in terms of the interventions that you use. And I want to include here that it's not just your client's social and personal identity, but it's also acknowledging and being able to discuss your own social and personal identity and be able to bring that into practice with your clients so that you can have a more authentic relationship. The second is reflexivity. Reflexivity is reflection, thinking about what you're thinking about what you're experiencing, thinking about what you're hearing from your client, and thinking about how you're responding or reacting to your client. So inviting your client to also reflect. So the practitioner is not the only one reflecting, but that in the actual session, in the work that you're doing with your client, you're both using reflexivity in practice. Another important concept is dialogue. So the process seeks to establish equity, egalitarianism, equality, so that the worker is not the expert. You are coming from a position where you're both contributing to the discussion equally. you're co-creating or collaborating so that your client feels valued and empowered as part of the social work process. Dialogue is about a back and forth. It's about a give and take. It's about both participating and listening, being engaged, and sharing in the creation of the social work process. And then consciousness raising. This is a strategy for stimulating awareness and change, especially about social structures, about the ways that the environment may or may not be supportive and validating, and understanding the ways that feminist theory have presented the social role and social situation of women. So consciousness raising, you can think a little bit about sharing with your client on the importance of understanding your place in society from a macro perspective. And finally, ethics of care is based on women's caring that arises from connection, relationship, and relatedness. We're going to talk a little bit more about ethics of care in the next slide. So Carol Gilligan's work, this is a picture of Carol Gilligan, and she developed her theories, I would say 1980s, 1990s. So she wrote in a different voice. She wrote Women's Ways of Knowing. She's written several books, many articles, has been a presenter. Her work is a really important foundation. So this is a quote. While an ethic of justice proceeds from the premise of equality, that everyone should be treated the same, an ethic of care rests on the premise of nonviolence, that no one should be hurt. So let me just make a point here. Carol Gilligan developed her theory in response to Lawrence Kohlberg, who was a researcher at Harvard. She was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg, and he developed moral development. So he developed this whole theory of stages of moral development. His subjects were all men. He developed his theory based only on male perspectives. So Carol Gilligan comes along and she decides that this focus on men excludes women, and that we can't assume that the male perspective, which was based on an ethic of justice and morality as seeking justice, that may be part of it, but that may not be the whole picture for women. So she developed an ethic of care. Let's look at what that means on the next slide. So what is the ethics of care? And here are some points about this perspective. We know that Carol Gilligan was the main theorist, really spawned a tremendous amount of research, other researchers focusing on women's development. So first bullet point, it celebrates our interdependence as human beings, right? Both men and women. We all need, at different points of a life cycle, we all need care during our lifetime. And we need different types of care. So she was looking at the importance of relationships. And what she suggested was that women find themselves and find morality and find meaning within relationships, right? And the importance of connecting with others, and not just an intimate relationship with a man, but the greater meaning of what it means to be a human being and being interdependent. Whether it's your partner, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your friend, whether it's your colleagues, the focus on communicating, understanding, and caring, very important. And that point that she makes, that we all need care, we all need nurturing, we all need love and affection, in different ways at different points in our life cycle or our life course. Okay? Think here about what we talked about Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson really centered one of his stages, intimacy versus isolation. And he discussed the need to form a relationship and the need to establish a life with your family. Well, what Gilligan is saying is we all need care, love, affection, connection throughout our life cycle. It's important at all stages. The second bullet point, ethics of care argues for a different value system in society so that care is recognized and supported properly. Well, I think we're still fighting for this, aren't we? If we weren't, we would have equitable education systems. We would have a value placed on social work and the care and support that social workers provide for so many marginalized and oppressed populations. We would see women's work being more valued than it is. We would see child care being valued both from a macro perspective as well as within supporting families. So it seeks to render care visible. So it seeks to look at the ways that people provide care and nurturing, right? Think about attachment. And I think that the importance of attachment and the way that attachment has been given prominence as an important theory of development is definitely related to the ethics of care. Now, she also links it to citizenship. Citizenship, not status of citizenship, but thinking about a civil society, thinking about what it means to create a society that values care and nurturing, that values the human condition, and that values the ability for each individual to be authentic and to live up to their potential. The next bullet point, in families, it is interested in everyday practices and meanings and seeks to understand these rather than to dismiss or judge them. Gilligan's theory was also developed at a time that there was a lot more focus on family social work, and that was a whole research area. So the spotlight on families, family behaviors, family practices, family dynamics, how families come together, thinking about the needs of families, all of that are important parts of ethics of care. And I would say that the role of women within families is a very important one. Think of the sandwich generation, where mainly women as caretakers taking care of both their children and their parents who are getting older and needing more help. And then the last bullet point, it is critical of contemporary social practices that seek to assign meaning. So what this means is that rather than be the expert and have a meaning for everything and have an interpretation for everything, a feminist approach is collaborative. It seeks to co-create. It seeks to learn from our clients and to understand the meaning that our client gives to events, situations, people, ideas, right? So on and so forth. So, and this is also important, being person-centered, active listening. So this idea is going to come up again in different ways, in different theories, but that we need to understand our client from their own perspective. And that is a response to the ways that therapists and social workers were seen as the experts on experience. So I'm going to end here with this slide. It's a quote from Carol Gilligan, and this is a contemporary quote. Feminism is not an issue of women only, or a battle of women versus men. It is the key ethical movement of our age. Despite decades of activism on gender equality and equal rights, patriarchy, in all its political, financial, and social forms, still persists. Reflect on that and come to class ready to discuss your responses to this quote by Carol Gilligan. Thank you for listening this far.